In the year 1154, England was ruled by a young and energetic monarch, Henry II, the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty. Just 21 years old, Henry ascended the throne after a period of prolonged civil unrest known as the Anarchy, a bitter conflict between his mother Empress Matilda and her cousin King Stephen. The kingdom he inherited was fractured and unstable, but Henry was not an ordinary ruler. He was a tireless reformer, a shrewd administrator, and a formidable warrior. But Henry's power stretched far beyond England. Long before he wore the crown, he had already inherited the Duchy of Normandy from his father and the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His dominion would soon expand even further, not through conquest, but through one of the most strategic and consequential marriages in medieval history. In 1152, just 2 years before he became king, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose status, wealth, and ambition matched his own. With her came the Duchy of Aquitaine, an immense and independent territory in southwestern France, known for its fertile lands, thriving towns, and sophisticated court culture. But Eleanor was far more than a vessel of land and lineage. She was nearly a decade older than Henry, already a mother, and the former Queen of France. To understand who she was and what made her so remarkable, we must go back, not to England, but to Aquitaine. To a court unlike any other in 12th century Europe, to the early years of a duchess who would one day rule beside kings and raise them from birth. Eleanor of Aquitaine was born around the year 1122 in the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast region in what is now southwestern France. She was the eldest daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and his wife Eleanor of Châtellerault. The exact location of her birth remains uncertain, possibly Poitiers or Bordeaux. But what is clear is that she was born into one of the most powerful and independent noble families in all of France. Her father, William X, was a powerful and influential nobleman, and he recognized early that Eleanor was not an ordinary daughter. Unlike most noble girls of her time, Eleanor received an extensive education. She was taught Latin, history, and literature. She was trained in riding, hunting, court etiquette, and even some elements of administration. Eleanor was also surrounded by troubadours, poets, and scholars. Eleanor's childhood was also shaped by a sense of preparation. As the heiress to Aquitaine, especially after the death of her only brother in early childhood, she was raised to understand power, diplomacy, and responsibility. Her father ensured she would be ready to govern, not just to marry. Then, in 1137, when Eleanor was around 15 years old, tragedy struck. Her father fell seriously ill while on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Before he died, he named King Louis VI of France as her guardian, a decision that would soon shape the next phase of her life. The aging French king understood the political weight Eleanor carried. Controlling Aquitaine through marriage would be a powerful advantage. Within months of William's death, Eleanor was betrothed to the French king's son, Louis. Louis, however, had not been raised for kingship. He had been intended for a life in the church and only became heir to the throne after the unexpected death of his elder brother. The marriage was quickly arranged and carried out. Only weeks later, Louis VI died, and the newly married Louis and Eleanor became king and queen of France. Eleanor, still a teenager, now found herself queen of one of the most powerful realms in Europe. But the match, though politically sound, was deeply flawed. As Queen of France, Eleanor quickly discovered that life at the Capetian court was very different from the lively and cultured halls of Aquitaine. The royal court in Paris was conservative and heavily influenced by the church. Louis VII, newly crowned and deeply devout, struggled to balance the duties of a king with the ideals of a monk. He preferred contemplation and religious devotion, while Eleanor was used to courts that celebrated poetry, politics, and personal expression. Despite their differences, the royal couple attempted to fulfill their roles. In 1145, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Marie.
But with no male heir, pressure on the marriage continued to mount. At the same time, Europe was turning its attention eastward. News had reached the continent that the Crusader state of Edessa had fallen to Muslim forces. In response, Pope Eugenius III called for a second crusade. Louis, driven by religious conviction and the desire for prestige, took up the cross, and Eleanor, unusually for a queen of the time, insisted on joining him. She was not merely accompanying her husband for ceremony, she brought her own retinue of knights and vassals from Aquitaine. The crusade, however, proved to be a disaster on many fronts. Poor planning, miscommunication with other leaders, and military failures plagued the campaign. Tensions between Eleanor and Louis grew deeper, especially during their time in Antioch. There, Eleanor reunited with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch. She urged Louis to remain in Antioch and support the Crusader states, but Louis insisted on continuing to Jerusalem. Rumors began to circulate, accusations of inappropriate closeness between Eleanor and her uncle, likely exaggerated or politically motivated, added strain to an already faltering marriage. By the time they returned to France in 1149, the relationship between Louis and Eleanor was irreparably damaged. She had failed to produce a son, the crusade had failed militarily, and the Queen's influence was seen by many in the French court as disruptive. Over the next few years, the couple lived increasingly separate lives. Eventually, both parties agreed to dissolve the marriage. In 1152, after 15 years as Queen of France, Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, officially because they were too closely related by blood. In truth, it was a political and personal separation. Their two daughters remained in France, and Louis retained control of the royal domain. But crucially, Eleanor retained Aquitaine. Her duchy was not absorbed into the French crown. She was once again the most powerful heiress in Europe. At around 30 years old, she was in possession of some of the most valuable lands in France. That made her a target. Powerful lords and opportunistic nobles quickly sought her hand in marriage, not for love, but for control of her vast estates. But Eleanor moved swiftly and decisively. She sent word to a rising political figure, Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. The two had likely met at the French court years early. Henry was 11 years her junior, bold, ambitious, and already positioning himself as a claimant to the English throne. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor and Henry were married in secret in Poitiers. There was no consultation with the French king Louis VII. The marriage stunned Europe. Not only had Eleanor defied convention by choosing her own husband a second time, but her choice had political consequences. By wedding Henry, she had effectively transferred control of Aquitaine into the hands of a man who was already heir to large territories in France than the French king himself. Though young, Henry had spent years preparing to press his claim to the English throne, then held by the aging and childless King Stephen. 2 years later, in December of 1154, after the death of King Stephen, Henry crossed the Channel and was crowned King Henry II of England. And beside him stood Eleanor of Aquitaine, once again a queen, but now with more power, more territory, and more at stake than ever before.